he's a white man, sort of. And he shows up and it's like, well, I'm white, you're white, we're the last people on Earth. We should end up together. There's no chemistry necessarily between them. There certainly is a lot of friction between him and Harry Belafonte. And by the end of the movie, they're shooting at each other on the steps of the UN. And Harry Belafonte turns and sees the swords into plowshares quote on the United Nations. And he's just like, we cannot live like this. And he drops his gun. And Inger Stevens walks up to Harry Belafonte, takes his hand. And then she walks up to Mel Ferrer and with her other hand takes his hand. And the three of them walk into the sunset together. So not just interracial, but polyamorous. In 1959, if you get a chance, look up this movie. It is free to watch and well worth watching. Of course, Harry Belafonte sings.
Oh, what's the name of it?
The World, the Flesh, and the Devil. If you search that on Galactic Journey, you will find it. So you're asking me, should we push the envelope? The answer is yes, and I think the milieu that will do it will be science fiction. Because we're the ones who tackle the harder things, the things that aren't quite true.
Heinlein's story that won the Hugo last year was
Bad. Oh, sorry, go on.
I know you didn't like it, but it pushed the envelope in terms of discussing sex.
Stranger in a Strange Land. Did any of you make it through that? Do we have any fans here?
To be clear,
You can tell me why I'm wrong.
Gideon really likes some of Heinlein's work. He did not like that particular novel.
Or Podcane of Mars.
Wow.
Or Glory Road.
I had an interesting reaction to that because I've been a Heinlein fan forever. Well, since I was 8 years old. And that was one of the first books I actually bought from Heinlein's.
Which
I
one?
actually
Stranger in a
I
Strange
think
Land?
somebody gave me Starship Troopers, which was his previous book.
Right,
That one was fun.
And I read Stranger in a Strange Land and being Heinlein, I read the thing more or less at one sitting, 9 or 10 hours. And I put it down, and I usually go back and reread pieces of the books, Heinlein books, after having read them like that. And this one I didn't touch for another 2 years. It was very strange.
I think that science fiction is a very interesting genre because you've got this sort of tradition of pulp and this tradition of sort of adventure in space and the sort of the strong men who go to tackle the other planets in a sort of Conan-esque way. But it's also because it's about the future. You can push the envelope on certain things. You can bring things in which other people might not expect, and you can do it in a subtle way. That's it. Gideon brought up that one story earlier. And there's other examples of that where you see women in unusual situations. Not very often. There are very few female main characters, just as there's very few female writers. The proportion of each month tends to be about 40 male writers to 2 females. That's about an average, I'd say. But the cases where you do see them occasionally, you will see women as doctors or other interesting positions. You'll see people in different perspectives and different ways. And you can really do that in science fiction because science fiction isn't taken as seriously as a genre, I think. And so people aren't necessarily on the lookout for things the way they might be in general fiction.
Have you, I had a friend who asked me, she has disabilities and she is always on the lookout for disabled characters in science fiction. And the last couple of years have seen some interesting books. There was a story by a female author, and I can't remember the name of it, but it starred a hero who had no legs, and him not having legs was actually credited to him being, he was a super spy with no legs. It was a cool story. Last year, Daniel Galouye wrote Dark Universe. I don't know if you guys have read that, but if you get a chance, it's really cool. It's after the bomb and humanity is underground, and we cannot see because there's no light. And so some of us have evolved very good hearing, some of us have evolved infrared vision, but for the most part, we're just blind and we deal with it. And there's a big part of the book that has to deal with when we finally get to leave the caves and can see, and how just disorienting and terrible. There's sort of is it actually worth it to have these senses, or are we better off being differently able? And that was fascinating. There's a recent book by Philip K. Dick called All We Marsmen, and it's being reprinted under the name Martian Time Slip. And it features an autistic boy as the centerpiece.
Obviously, it's not called autism.
No, it actually was. I was incorrect. Yeah, autism is the word. He's an autistic child, and he has autism. Their understanding of what autism was 55 years ago is not as sophisticated as what it will be in 55 years. But just the fact that they had this autistic character and a lot of things centered around, it's a fascinating book by Philip K. Dick. I imagine in 55 years, Philip K. Dick books are all going to be hot properties to be made into movies of some kind or another. Yeah, he just came out with The Man in the High Castle, which I wasn't that fond. Everyone loved that movie, or that book. I thought it was okay.
Speaking of the characters, that one by Henry Castle.
Oh yeah, The Ship Who Sang, which stars a ship. It is a brain. So the idea is when you have people who are so critically disabled that they're unable to function well at all, really, in society, their brains get disembodied. I don't know if you call this horrific or liberating, but their brains are...
Their bodies are, they basically become the brain of the starship. I don't think the brain is actually pulled out, as they still have their bodies, but they become the...
She calls them shells.
Okay. Right, their bodies are completely non-functional, but their brains are perfectly good brains. And they become ships. They can travel the stars. And this story called The Ship Who Sang is all about the pilot and co-pilot, which is essentially the one who runs the ship and this brain of the ship. That was fascinating. I'd love to see more from that. Next question. Someone who's not you. Someone who's not you. You. What about UFOs? Really? UFOs have pretty much been debunked at this point. There are articles coming out in the newspaper that show that everyone who sees a UFO is really seeing Venus or a weather balloon. But on the other hand, as UFOs become less the province of science fiction, they become more the province of the kooky people. So there was a story just this year about 2 people who were abducted by aliens, and that's the sort of woo-woo stuff that frankly should not be between the pages of our legitimate science fiction magazines. No offense to you, ma'am. There could be aliens visiting us, but and they may in fact, look like the fellow on My Favorite Martian.
They used to build UFOs.
Then they weren't unidentified. You knew exactly what
I
they
knew
were.
what they were, but nobody else did.
All right. Someone on this side.
Something you didn't mention is that C.S. Lewis died 2 days ago.
C.S. Lewis and Aldous Huxley died the same day as Kennedy. That would have been front page news any other day. Instead it was page whatever. Yeah, and Huxley, by the way, he not only did he do Brave New World, but he is a huge fan of the new line in pharmaceuticals. And it's really too bad he didn't live to see its fruition.
By the way, we also, in addition to the blog, if you're a modern person who doesn't have time to read, there's a Twitter feed that constantly has updates of what's going on in the world. And the C.S. Lewis's and Aldous Huxley's death were both reported on in the Twitter feed.
Right.
What's the Twitter handle?
Journey Galactic. And you can also see it if you go to the site, it just plasters the right-hand side of the site.
Yeah, if you turn your phone this way, or if you have a full-size computer, you'll see the Twitter feed on the right every time, and a little reference to the Instagram too.
All right, well, I'm going to ask a question of someone here who works at JPL. Can you tell me the first interplanetary probe?
I want to say Pioneer, but I think you're going to tell me I'm wrong.
Which Pioneer?
I don't know.
So that's actually a fine guess, especially since it's a little bit of a trick question. So Pioneer 5, which was not JPL, went out into interplanetary space as far as the orbit of Venus, but was not intended to rendezvous. It was the first demonstration of long-distance communications over tens of millions of kilometers. The first successful interplanetary space program was actually done by JPL, and it was Mariner 2. And Mariner 2 was huge news, because it was the first space probe that could make news for months, right? It launches, and then it's out there, and it almost died. It got hit by a meteor, but it made it to Venus and gave us information on Venus we never knew. So I'm sure you guys have all read Edgar Rice Burroughs, and we all had the idea that Venus was this swamp, dinosaur-laden planet. And it turns out it's not. It's actually 400 degrees Kelvin and has no water in it, and is just a hellish place.
Sulfuric acid.
Yeah, it's not a great place. Now, here's the question. Does anyone know what the first mission to Mars was?
Mariner, first, Mariner 4?
So, in fact, next year there will be 2 Mariners being launched to the Red Planet, Mariners 3 and 4. They're also being made by JPL. But, and this is something nobody knows about 55 years from now, the Soviets launched a Mars probe called Mars. And it made it about 2/3 of the way there before it ran out of, it stopped sending telemetry. And it made it almost all the way to Mars before they told us about it. But in fact, there was a Soviet probe that passed Mars in 1963. So that was pretty interesting. One of the things we do at The Journey is, it's very easy to get this narrative of space history where it's just the events. This launch, this launch, this launch. This guy went into space, this guy went into space. And what you never hear talked about is, what were the scientific returns? That's why you send stuff into space, to find out what's up there. And one thing we do at The Journey is we're very cognizant of these scientific returns, and we digest them for the layman. So you understand why it's exciting that Explorer goes up and measures the micrometeorite flux, or sees what the gamma ray flux is, or measures where the Van Allen belts are. So you can learn all about the state of science, space science, as it existed back then. Here's an interesting one, Pluto. So who thinks Pluto is a planet? Who grew up with the notion that Pluto is a planet? And how many of you are dead set that Pluto is a planet, come hell or high water? Well, I want you to understand that even in 1960, I read every single scientific article on Pluto as of 1960 for this article that I wrote on Pluto. There's an article on every single planet. The only ones I haven't done yet are Saturn and Mars, and Saturn is coming soon, and I'll do Mars right before we go there. I don't care about Mars. Everybody loves Mars. Even in 1960, we knew that Pluto might not be a planet, right? Because Percival Lowell says, look at the variation of the orbits. There must be a planet out there. And then he dies. You know, no offense to him. People die. And then Clyde Tombaugh points his telescope and he sees something that he says is a planet. Well, it must be this planet X, except it's not big enough, it's not bright enough. And for 30 years after that, and beyond that, there was no consensus that Pluto was actually a planet. In fact, as early as 1931, a scientist was saying, I don't think Pluto's a planet. I think Pluto is a member of a population of Pluto-sized and smaller objects that orbit at that distance. And there may be a planet, but I don't think Pluto's the one we're looking for. Obviously, that guy was completely wrong, right? Right? Okay. So
something else we talk about on The Journey is the failures when things blow up. That's something that we really don't talk about after the fact. If something blew up on a launch pad or failed, who cares? But we talk about it then because it's exciting to know in context, okay, this was supposed to go up today, but weather stopped it from doing it, so it's going to go up tomorrow. And that can be exciting too. What's
great, we don't know that the Air Force keeps sending up satellites every week or two. And Kennedy put a clamp down. So originally Eisenhower was like, okay, so much publicized. Let everybody know that these are spy satellites. Because if we do that and Russia doesn't complain, then we can just keep doing it. And then Kennedy said, we're not going to do that anymore. And so now the Air Force sends up satellites, and we have no idea that these are spy satellites. Except the journalists always know that these are spy satellites. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union, which did not send up satellites for the longest time, has been launching its series of Cosmos satellites to explore and return information about the space. And every single launch they do was Cosmos 22 was launched to explore space and return information. None of these have produced any articles in scientific journals, and many of them will go up and come down in 4 days, almost as if they have cameras on board and they're developing the film, but they're gone up to explore and return information on space. So this is something that's happening as we speak.
Well, Earth is in space.
Technically, Earth is in space, yes.
So they're returning information about the Earth and, whatever missile installations happen to be on the Earth. Technically, I suppose it is true.
Technically, it is true. But this is happening like every week. There's a Cosmos going up or a Discoverer satellite going up, and they're taking it's candid camera. I think Alan Funt has his own camera in space. So be careful when you pick your nose because it might end up on television. Newcomer, you have the opportunity that no one else has had to ask me a question
About 1963.
about 1963 and maybe win a prize. What is something you would like to know about? Science fiction, space race, anything.
What's your area of
1963.
interest?
Oh. What is your birthday? August 1st. So this person exists as of the Galactic Journey. He's a squalling baby. He's sitting in the back. His parents are probably keeping him quiet. And like in Passover, he's the son who's too young to inquire. So, go ahead.
Back in talking about Mariner 2, when the results came back and were published, I saw a cartoon where this family of creatures that kind of looked like sweet potatoes were out barbecuing, and they saw the probe land in their barbecue.
Oh, wow.
That's true. Although Mariner 2 just flew by, it didn't actually land. At some point they'll drop a probe, but that has not happened yet. All right, let me ask. Oh, go ahead.
How is the popular support amongst the American taxpayer for space exploration at this stage?
That's a fantastic question, and you're probably going to be surprised by the answer. So, we hear a lot, we see Kennedy's speech, we're going to put a man on the moon before this decade is out, not because it is easy, but because it is hard. Stirring stuff. And as we may know, LBJ is a big space supporter. But in fact, by 1963, there is huge resistance to NASA in Congress. And appropriations are getting cut. It's a big deal. Part of it is the spectacular failure of JPL to make a working Ranger probe. It is, NASA is trying to spin it as well as possible, and part of the reason we have a Gemini program, I don't know if you know this, but after Mercury went up, Mercury was done with Gordo Cooper, although Alan Shepard really wanted a several-day flight. He wanted there to be one more space shot, and the astronauts actually went to the White House to personally lobby the president, and the president called Jim Webb, who was running NASA at the time, and said, "Who the hell is in charge over there?" Actual quote. Mercury was done, and Apollo was some nebulous time in the future, and Gemini was this bridge program because NASA knew if there was not something to keep public attention while the Russians kept doing these space spectaculars, that Apollo might not happen. And part of the reason I understand that Kennedy was so in favor of a joint mission with the Soviets to the moon is he was desperately worried about losing so much support he was worried about it failing, he was worried about funding, and this was a way to keep it going, was teaming up with the Russians. Interestingly enough, Khrushchev at one point said, "We're not going to the moon. Do whatever you want. We're not going to the moon." Then he said, "Yes, we are. Yes, we are going to the moon."
Actually, we kind of shot ourselves in the foot with the nuclear test ban treaty and the growing détente. When the Russians were scary and going to the moon, then and when Sputniks went up, and that was a huge deal when Sputnik did. But when they weren't suddenly quite so scary anymore, when we weren't as scared of them, then we weren't as willing to give NASA money.
Right. And then you.
Back on the JPL blowing shit up. There was there was.
You didn't do it on purpose, I know.
Well, there was a culture, well, a saying that was in the environment that our spacecraft blow up. And it was this monkey on the back, and it was really very discouraging and also invigorating for the people. It's like, God damn it, we're gonna make it work. And so I knew people who were in the program at the time, and it was very interesting because there was a perception in the public that our space probes always blow up.
And the fact is, it wasn't that the Soviet probes failed any less, it's that they told us about it less. And even by 1963, you can read the NASA reports, we knew that they were sending probes into orbit that were supposed to then fly off to Venus, and they sputtered and they just stayed in orbit. You, sir?
Can you tell me anything about what's happening with the FFRDC, Rand, and the Aerospace Corporation?
FFRDC.
The federally funded research and development center.
So I actually am familiar with aerospace pretty well because they split from STL back when the government said you can't do private contracts and military contracts, so civilian contracts and military contracts at the same time. If I could answer your question obliquely, the biggest thing that's happening right now is fights over what will eventually become the F-111. It is this swing-wing modern aircraft that is supposed to work for the Air Force, the Navy, and every other organization that could use a fighter. And it's new technology, but it costs a lot, and McNamara is in favor of it, but Congress doesn't want to spend the money. There's a lot of boondoggle projects like that. The B-70, you guys heard of that? So the B-70 was supposed to be the next generation bomber, right? You had the B-47, the B-52, those are subsonic bombers. You had the B-58, which is a supersonic bomber. And then it was going to be superseded by the B-70, which was this supersonic bomber. But by the time you could have a bomber that could go Mach 3, they had missiles that could go Mach 4, and there wasn't really a point in building this thing. So funding has been taken from that. So I don't know if that answers your question or what you're looking for.
I was just interested in finding out what you might have to say about Rand or aerospace or some of the other advisory places for the Air Force.
So aerospace is interesting because places like STL and aerospace are building what eventually is going to be circuits on a chip. And the ability to miniaturize components. I don't know if you guys know this, but as few as 10 years ago, everything was vacuum tube powered. And if you've had a radio, vacuum tubes are great, by the way, they're very resilient, right? But if you turn on a vacuum tube TV or radio, it takes like 20 seconds for the thing to warm up. And it's heavy. When Shockley invented the transistor in the late 40s, that was a game changer. And now these military advisory companies are building these miniaturized components, transistors on a plate, essentially. And eventually that'll get to the point where you can cram so much. And this is important because American rockets are small compared to Soviet rockets. So the more bang you can get for your thrust buck, the more you can do. What was fascinating about Explorer 6 and later Pioneer 5, again STL over JPL, is they invented digital communications as opposed to analog communications. And you can get a lot more data on a channel with digital communications than analog communications. And these things are made possible because these companies like the ones you're talking about are pioneering these little tiny things that can go into space.
Literature question. About a decade ago, this trilogy came out, Lord of the Rings. It really did make a big splash. So some of you might have read it. It was really popular, but there haven't been any imitators. There's nothing like it out there, or at least nothing I can find. Do you have any recommendations?
So that is, they have not made a real distinction in terms yet, but there's definitely different families of fantasy, right? That is something you might call high fantasy, right? As opposed to Robert E. Howard's Conan series, which you see a lot of. I can definitely make you a recommendation. Have you read 3 Hearts and 3 Lions by Poul Anderson? So that's available through my site. That's a fantastic book about a guy who, he's a Danish person who ends up in this completely fantasy world that plays by his own rules, and it's charming as heck. Glory Road is technically in the same genre, although not the same caliber.
I really don't like that.
No, I actually am very fond of Heinlein. Space Who Will Travel, Farmer in the Sky, and I like Starship Troopers, but I bounced off Stranger in a Strange Land so hard it was like a racquetball. And I stand by my right to do that in this free country. Another one is, have you read The Incomplete Enchanter by Fletcher Pratt and L. Sprague de Camp?
Yes.
That also features a fellow who wants to transport himself into the land of fairy and ends up in Ragnarok. So there is a budding alternate world genre. Tolkien is popular and has his adherents. I understand that they may republish a lot of his stuff over the next few years. The big author who's making a revival right now, any of you read Edgar Rice Burroughs as a kid? He did Tarzan, Pellucidar, Caprona, Mars, Venus, Moon. So all of this stuff is being reprinted by Ace right now. And in fact, the guy who did Krenkel, the guy who did the art for these Ace editions, won the Hugo last year. It was actually quite a surprise. I hadn't heard of him, but when I saw his work, I saw why. Normally we see people like Frias and M. Schwiller and Gauguin. These are the kind of people who are at the top. But this Krenkel guy made it. So there is a huge Edgar Rice Burroughs revival right now. There are fanzines devoted to him. There are sections of existing fanzines that cover, they're called the Barsoomian Times, that will cover Edgar Rice Burroughs. My favorite is the Pellucidar. I am not fond of Tarzan. But yeah. Sorry, on a tangent there. But go ahead.
Color TV.
Color television. Does anyone have a color television in your house? Anyone? Raise your hand if you have a color TV in your house. Yeah, not too many of you yet. This is the first season that I'm starting to see a lot more stuff in color. In fact, I was watching NBC's coverage of the Kennedy assassination. By the way, cannot hold a candle. Brinkley and Huntley cannot hold a candle to Walter Cronkite.
Absolutely.
Right? But I noticed that they had a Fort Worth affiliate, and he was broadcasting in color, even though Huntley and Brinkley were in black and white. The Dinah Shore show was the first one I saw that was regularly in color. But more and more shows are coming out in color. Bonanza, any of you follow Bonanza?
Yes.
It's a Western. Among many Westerns. I suspect by 1965 the majority of television will be in color. And I think that's going to be sped up actually by the Kennedy assassination. Interestingly enough, I don't know if you guys know this, but this season, this fall season 63, was the first season that TV news really came into its own, especially this weekend. Because before, TV news was something that occupied an 11-minute segment of television every day. 11 minutes, that's all the TV you need, right? You get all the rest of your news from the newspaper or the radio or your magazines. This season, they started expanding coverage to 30 minutes a day. They also set up the technology for live reporting. And they weren't going to debut it in November, but obviously the death of a president is something that merits constant live reporting. So this weekend saw a transformation of television from being sort of this news sideshow to being the centerpiece. I can just bet that for the next 10, 20 years, however long he does it, we're going to turn to Walter Cronkite and listen to what he has to say about the news.
It's interesting too because, from a modern perspective, we're used to these sort of very polished news shows, but watching the footage from that time, Walter Cronkite is sitting at his desk.
Crying,
Yeah,
weeping.
well, not at first. He was brought file after file or paper after paper of incoming news, and he kept saying, "It's not official. It's not official. We don't have." And he got more and more reports. The doctor, the priest, Dan Rather.
Yeah, you may not know him. He's a little-known reporter out of Texas.
Right.
It was actually really interesting seeing everything that was going on, just him reporting and in the background. It was quite impressive how he maintained, like, he'd take off his glasses, look at the camera, talk to the camera, and like they'd be giving him reports and he'd have to put on his glasses, quickly read the report and keep reporting it while he was doing it. And that kind of like multitasking in such a high stress situation was like truly like amazing to see.
And then when he finally got official confirmation, that was when we saw him tear up. And it was not, he wasn't drenched, but it was very clear that moment, he choked up a little bit on camera. It was very moving to see all the different shots of people weeping and reacting.
There was a science fiction story that came out just a couple months ago. I cover it in the journey. I think it came out in Analog. It's just a 4-page story, but it was about a fellow. They manufacture drama in the news because it makes good television. They would go out, the building would collapse and kill a kid, and they'd catch the crying mother, and the guy would have a camera mounted to his shoulder, and they gave her drugs to heighten the emotion of the event.
That's terrible. Well, it's science fiction.
It's a science fiction story, but it's interesting that this happened and is sort of in parallel. It's sort of prescient by a couple of minutes that news is going to become the show that people want to watch. One can imagine sometime in the far future 24-hour news where they just sit and talk to you for 24 hours and go on the scene, maybe even manufacture news crises to keep people interested. Can you imagine something like that?
That sounds horrible. I wish.
Question for you, and I don't know if this is not your area, but when you guys were talking about the satellites and all this kind of stuff, one of the things that always confused me is, I think it was Eisenhower and Khrushchev signed this freedom of the skies thing where the idea was we're supposed to be able to look at each other so we know you're not launching a missile and I'm not launching a missile. Do you have any comment on how we went from freedom of the skies to by 1963, we're not telling them when we launch a spy satellite and they're not telling us, and we're having these B-47 flights and all this secrecy?
Well, remember, the most important part of that is who does it first. So I don't know if you guys know this, but we had the ability to send a satellite into space by 1956. There were several different armed services all preparing rocket boosters. We had good Americans like Bennett von Braun developing what was the Jupiter rocket. We had the Navy developing Vanguard under civilian auspices. We had the Air Force building Thor and the Atlas. And in '56, if he had wanted to and had permission to, he could have launched the Jupiter into space. But Eisenhower didn't want to do that. He didn't want to break that seal. He wanted the Soviets to do it. And he anticipated it would happen in the International Geophysical Year of 1957 and 1958. The International Geophysical Year, which for some reason lasted 18 months. And the Soviets did that. And by sending something into space, then we could say, well, they did it, so it's okay if we do it.